you understand why. All righty then, so let's go ahead. We'll start here, and we'll wait and see when that comes up. We are up and running. We're going to try to go through just a little bit of the material we went through last week very quickly. I promise you this is not going to be a complete rehash over what we've already looked at. We asked, where did we come from? Where did the earth come from? We said that the creationist, the Bible view, is given in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 1 giving emphasis on the creation itself and all the things of creation, where Genesis chapter 2 gives the emphasis on man and man's creation. And so we said, where did we come from? Well, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Where did men come from? Well, the Bible says that God said, let us make man in our image and after our likeness. And that's exactly what took place. It took 6 days in which to do it. And it'd be wonderful to stop there, but we said, the Bible, the first 11 chapters of Genesis are the most attacked that there is. And we talked about how that we're not the only fishers of men as Christians. There's many people out there that are trying to inundate our children, trying to take them away from the principles of the Bible, trying to get them to not like the Bible, to try to question the Bible. Can it possibly be true, these things that we see? And so that's why it's important that from time to time we talk about creation and we talk about evolution, that we talk about these things that are in direct opposite view of Christianity. And we talked about how everybody loves the dinosaurs. When I go to the Smithsonian, I want to go into not only where all the planes and the spaceships and things are, but I like going and looking at those dinosaurs. Little did I know that most of that there is just not even bones, really. A lot of it's just made up stuff, that they have some bones but not the rest, but they go ahead and manufacture what they need to go ahead and put it together. We talked about the geological time scale too, and how that they believe that the earth is millions of years old. As a matter of fact, the dinosaurs were supposed to have roamed the earth some 160 million years ago. 160 million years. That's a lot. You ever thought about that? Well, they take a preacher probably 2 or 3 years to make that kind of money, just to give you an idea. 160 million is a lot. And they say that's how old the dinosaurs are, but before them were even these other little creatures that we'll talk about here in a moment. And so we wanted to talk about the dinosaurs because children love dinosaurs, and they're a tool. And so we looked at some of the historical evidence, and we talked about dragons for just a little bit. How that even Herodotus, the father of history, actually wrote about dragons. Every culture of antiquity has, ideas about dragons and talk about dragons. Even the very flag of the country of Wales, or, part of England, has as its, the thing on its flag has a huge dragon. Even in Asian art, the Chinese, you ever go to a Chinese restaurant, just look up on the roof and stuff. They're much into this idea of dragons, and it doesn't stop with the East. It doesn't stop with England. Also, this is a shot of a horned beast from the Babylonian Empire on the walls of the Ishtar Gate. And so one of their gods, they believe, they called it Surish, if that helps you anything. Then we looked at some of the physical evidence. We talked about some temples. A particular temple that's in Thailand, during the Khmer reign. And we brought out the point that in one of this where there's all these little animals drawn, you can look real closely and you'll even see a stegosaurus that is there. And children don't have any problem identifying that. They know exactly what that is. We talked about a tomb, Richard Bell's tomb in Carlisle, England from 1500 or 1495 A.D. And how that he had these pictures drawn on his. Now, they're ancient. In fact, the word dinosaur is of recent invention. Prior to 1830, there was no English word dinosaur. It was a word they came up with. And they got it from the Latin and Greek, which had the idea of a great lizard. And so, because a lot of people say, why doesn't the Bible talk about dinosaurs? Well, you'll remember we started out the first lesson last week reading from Job chapter 40 and 41, where indeed it sounds exactly like the Leviathan and the Behemoth. And the Behemoth, we don't even know what that was. We just have to go off the description that's given because it's simply a transliteration, if you will, of the Hebrew. Not sure what that critter is. Not only the Behemoth, but brethren, there's several animals in the, for instance, anybody ever read of the unicorn in the Old Testament? Well, we know there was no unicorn, but they didn't know what it was. And so they just gave it a name. And so that's one of the things. Some people look at the Bible and say, look at that, they believed in unicorns. Well, they had Hebrew words. They didn't know what critters they were talking about, so they just attached names, and that's where we get our English word, a behemoth. And we also talked about some work, some art from the Grand Canyon. and how that even people who are not, they're not in this fight, they don't care about creation or evolution, but they do care about rock art. And they said, you know what, that's a dinosaur, that's a big lizard or something like that standing on its tail. And we have some quotes from that, but we're not going to spend much time with it. Then this was from the Natural Bridge National Monument, and you can see the original there and the enhanced version. And then just a few miles down the road in a place called Blanding, Utah, and I got a picture here of Kyle Budd. He's standing, excuse me, not Kyle Budd, Eric Lyons probably would not appreciate that. Eric Lyons standing beside two of the bones that were found in that area, about 40 miles away from where this picture was drawn. And this is of an actual dinosaur, that looks like the one that they had a picture of. Now we're going to be looking at some new material, and I'll try to slow down just a little bit to show you the significance of what dinosaurs are. You go, on Happy Meals, you'll find dinosaurs. And, one of the things that really gets me about that, they could just leave it off, but they don't. And that is on the Happy Meal, they'll talk about, can you find the Tyrannosaurus Rex? And so you got to circle the Tyrannosaurus Rex or whatever. But then on the Happy Meal itself says, now Tyrannosaurus Rexes roamed the earth some 100 plus million years ago. Well, that's false, right there, just false as it can be. Yet they put it on that McDonald's bag, and your children, my grandchildren, your grandchildren read that, and it's so as matter of fact. And so when they read that, and then we try to tell them, listen, humans and dinosaurs actually lived together at one time, they're like, how can that possibly be? As a matter of fact, there was a gospel preacher a number of years back. Bert Thompson did a huge amount of writing, rebuking and getting after and trying to get debates with a fellow by the name of John Clayton, who was a member of the church, did a lot of work in apologetics, in Christian evidences. And he would just say the very idea that human beings and dinosaurs roam the earth at the same time is just preposterous. He would just say it's ludicrous. Did you even think that? And yet the Bible says that everything that was made in the first 6 days that God created. And if dinosaurs are here, and we got the bones proving they were, if they were here, then they were created during that 1 week period, and so was man. But see, that's where John Clayton just said, no, that can't be true. And so he took off on the idea of the gap theory, or these day-age theory, where each one of those days represents millions of years. And we showed from the book of Exodus, same word being used. It says, the book there says they observed the Sabbath in 6 days, 6 literal days, the Lord made the earth, and on the seventh, the Sabbath, he rested. And so the reason I brought this up, the reason I want you to see that is because if I throw this picture up here, what would you think? What's the first thing that pops in your mind? That's exactly what you'd think, is it not? Because that's synonymous with it. You'd think of Aflac. And I absolutely love those commercials. And I keep thinking they're going to run out of material, but they keep surprising me with the new material that they get. And then if you think of this fella right here, well, what comes to mind next? Well, you know as well as I do, Geico. That's exactly right. And I love that little place where he's in his New York apartment, because that's about how I envision those things too, when the Chinese takeout bowls is big. So when it comes to dinosaurs, they are the poster children for evolution. That's how they sink it in, that's how they lay the hook, and that's how they bring it in and go, listen, there's no way that something, look at this thing right here. This is called the Argentinosaurus. You'll never believe where they found that. You'll never figure it out. Yeah, it was found in Brazil. No, I'm just kidding. But look at the size of that thing. Now, they don't have most of those bones, okay? If you'll notice, they all look alike. They're all concrete or whatever. It is a fabrication. But that is built to scale so that you'd get some idea of just how big that thing is. Here's one, and I can't remember what museum this was, and I didn't even add it in my notes, which is not good. But it's a huge, huge animal. It's called the Argentinosaurus, and if you can say that next word, you're better than me. But it is a large, large animal. But do you realize that it's not the largest animal that's ever lived on this earth? A lot of people say, how could dinosaurs and humans coexisted? How could they have been on this same planet? Do you know that the greatest size animal that has ever lived is with us to this very day? That's right. And according to, I think it was Star Trek, the third movie, actually helped save the world. If y'all, watch those. Remember the blue whale? The blue whale. Now that's Star Trek. I know that's not, y'all don't watch that, but anyway, it's a movie. Anyway, it is the largest animal that has ever lived. It dwarfs that Argentinosaurus that we just saw. Here's a picture of the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and so they have a display where they have, now it's not a real one, it's not stuffed or anything, but they have it built, and it's just the hugest of animals. The largest animal that has ever existed from the fossil record or anything else is alive and well and swimming in our oceans. Look at the size of this thing. Of course, the top is the blue whale. At the bottom there, you can see an elephant. You can see behind it the mammoth, the woolly mammoth, the Tyrannosaurus rex behind it, the what we call the brontosaurus is there. Look how it is dwarfed by this animal that still roams the earth today. It is a huge animal. It weighs as much as 2,667 people, each weighing about 200 pounds. That's how large this animal is. So to think that large animals could have existed and lived with man is not far-fetched at all. As a matter of fact, did you know that a fellow by the name of Hannibal, who decided he'd go and whoop some Romans, he wanted to take over the world. Do you know what he had that was the secret weapon of his army? He had, I think it was over 60 trained elephants. That's right. Back in those days, we're talking the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries, what was it, 4th century, 5th century? Hannibal had all these elephants. These animals were trained, and they would go out into combat. They would go, you know how horses, sometimes, you try to get them in a situation, you had to put blinders on them and things. You have to train those animals to do that. We've trained elephants. Elephants are much larger than men. And elephants and men have coexisted. They've trained elephants. You can go some places, they even have elephants riding little scooters. You ever been to the circus and see that? I mean, here's these large animals, 20 times the size of a man, and yet they have been trained. We've lived with those and so forth. And so to say that that's, it's outrageous to believe that animals that size could have lived with man, well, there's huge animals that live with us today. Now I want to move on to some more physical evidence. And brethren, if you have opportunity, now this is one of those areas where you could spend a lot of time. And the two sides are as diametrically opposed as they possibly could be. But in a little place, a little province called Ica, now this of course is Peru, South America. And inside of Peru, there's a small place called Ica. It's a region. And in there they have what's called the Ica stones. Now the Ica stones, you can read as much for them as you can read against them. It is true that some of these stones have been fabricated, that some people saw an opportunity to make some money, and so they started making some of these stones, but they're able to analyze these and be able to see which ones had properties that made it old, stuff that would grow inside the etching and things they could carbon date and so forth. And then there's those that are relatively young, and they know that these have been fabricated. But because some things are counterfeit doesn't mean that everything is counterfeit. And so science has to weigh in there. But if you get a chance, you look up ICA stones and take a look at that. You can see the evidence. There's a lot of, people from NASA and so forth, scientists have looked at these things. They say there's no reason to believe that the ones they've examined are false, whereas others have looked at some evidence and said some of them are fabricated. But just because some are fabricated doesn't mean that all of them are. It'd be like having a $20 bill in your wallet, and you go to Walmart or whatever, and they run that little pin across it, and they say, oh, this is a counterfeit bill. And so then you go home, get in your cash drawer or whatever, and you get out all the 20s you got and throw them in the trash. Say, well, we wouldn't do that, would we? Same thing with these stones. You just don't throw everything out. Well, some of the interesting things, if you see this one, look at this stone here. That is the idea of like a Tyrannosaurus rex or some big, huge lizard that is standing upright, and it is chasing a man. Now, if I saw that big lizard and I was the size of that man, I would be doing exactly what he is doing, and it looks like he is running. Also, you have here a man riding a triceratops. Now, this one, I believe, has been proven to be antiquated, to be old. Some of these were found, like 100 years ago and dug up, and some were sent to Europe, and so they're all over the place. But this one fellow started buying a lot of them, and that apparently is where some fabrication came in from the place he was buying them. Some people saw that he wanted them, and so they started trying to make them. But some people have looked at this and just scoffed. The very idea that a man could ride a triceratops and said that's got to be made up. But yet, have you ever seen a man ride an elephant? I've seen that. As a matter of fact, we've gone to zoos and places where you could buy a ticket to ride an elephant. I have never done that. That is not a desire that I have. I would not want to ride a triceratops. But, you know, hey, some people might. But here is one of those stones, and there's a particular fella in that area that's bought hundreds of these. And he has, has an exhibit, and some people have, I encourage you, if you have an opportunity to go and to look at that, it's pretty good evidence of the fact that men and dinosaurs could have coexisted. Some people would say it's a hoax. Others would say, that it is not. I encourage you to take a look at it. I don't believe that they all are. This is from Taylor Trail in Biloxi River, which is near Glen Rose, Texas. Now, this is not fossil evidence, as in finding a bone, but what you have here are footprints. Okay, and in these footprints, you have what are human footprints. Human footprints are very distinct from an animal. You have human footprints running right across an animal, a dinosaur's feet, where it walked across this same sand bed, and yet they're supposed to be separated by about 100 million years. That's a real difficult thing if you're trying to say that that's the case. Here is actually a picture of where a human footprint is actually inside of one of these dinosaur footprints. This right here, I wanted you to see this because this has been carbon dated at being about 250,000 years old. It is not 250,000 years old. As a matter of fact, when they made hammers like this, it's been a little over 200 years. But you see how it got into some sediment, it hardened up, and so it is fossilized. But this is not a 100 million year old hammer used in the coal mines. It's not what it is. It's relatively new, but because of the things it went through, it has the look of fossilized, like you would think of a fossilized dinosaur bone. And here's a real big kicker for me, though. I learned about this very young, when I just started preaching. The trilobite, it's one of the first things that you'll see. It's a little bug you can see there on the bottom, and it's about the size of a penny. And it is if you get the fossil record of when fossils, what kind of fossils you ought to find and what place in the earth, as far as the oldest to the newest. He's on the bottom of the food chain, if you will. I mean, this guy's been around from the pre-whatever era. I mean, he's way before the dinosaurs. And so he's supposed to have been, done away with, extinct by the time of the dinosaurs. Yet here, if you'll notice, that is a human footprint. That human footprint has on the bottom of it a trilobite. And so what are we doing here? This is a shoe. That ain't a footprint. It ain't like some caveman was running around. What are we saying here? Well, it'd be very hard to find a trilobite to go step on in modern day. So the idea of the fossil record being what it ought to be, it's just full of holes. Look at where this trilobite is on this geological time scale. It is if you see it way down on the bottom on the very right there, that rust-colored thing, that's the trilobite. It is supposed to have been dead millions of years, especially before man came along. Remember, as far as our evolutionary friends say, we are very, very young. And then something that just jumps out, and it's like unget-overable. They have found dinosaur bones now. Now remember, dinosaurs have supposed to have been extinct now for over 70 million years. They've lived, on the earth from 160 to about 70 million years ago. And so they have found dinosaur bones fossilized. Folks, do you realize how 70 million years, not 70 years, not 700 years, not 7,000 years, not 70,000, not 700,000, 70 million years. Tell me tissue is going to survive that length of time. It's not. It's not. But not only have they found this T-Rex, this particular T-Rex bone, it's a matter of record, they found it's got soft tissue. It's got blood vessels. Notice some of the things here. The T-Rex soft tissue headlines. This is from 2007. 70 million-year-old Tyrannosaurus rex fossil dug out of a hunk of sandstone has yielded soft tissue, including blood vessels. Says paleontologists were stunned to find that the soft tissue of a 70 million-year-old dinosaur was preserved within a fossil of a Tyrannosaurus rex. They ought to be stunned. Why? Because science tells them that can't be. You can't have something that's still and the lady that was describing it says it's cartilage, and it still bends. It moves. You push it in, it pops back out. Just like you can't do that nowadays with somebody that's been dead for a couple hundred years ago. All of that tissue is going to be gone. And yet we're told that 70 million year old, bottom line is, things are a lot younger than we've been told. Notice also Alan Boyle, who was a editor for the MSNBC, where these quotes are coming from 2007, says today paleontologists are still stunned. Why shouldn't they be? Not only to find material that looks like dinosaur cartilage, blood vessels, blood cells, and bone cells, but see the stuff in so many different specimens. It's everywhere. It says there are a growing number of tissue samples. It's just not a fluke occurrence. In other words, it's happening more and more. That should not be in something that's been in the ground for 70 million years. It just does not work that way, and I think they know it as well. And so some of the things, this idea of soft tissue, short-lived carbon-14 found in all tested dinosaur bones. It wasn't supposed to be here then, but it's there. How do you explain that? 520-year half-life of DNA, and yet it's still in those. It's amazing. It says Egyptian mummy research estimates that things 10,000 years old is the maximum that you're going to have for any kind of soft tissue. 10,000 years. They're finding mummies that anything, the tissue, it's not there. Yet here we're supposed to believe that these dinosaur bones have it. Young folks, dinosaurs, humans, I think we've seen historical evidence, we've seen physical evidence, old folks as well, that human beings and dinosaurs could have, and not only could have, but did coexist. Now, I'm sure they didn't hang out together. I don't think they went down to the Sonic and got an ice cream together. It'd be a lot like, lions and tigers and bears, oh my. That's how I look at those things. It always amazes me when I go to the Smokies sometimes and drive those trails, or out walking, and you see people, and they see a bear, and they go to the bear. Folks, that is not my first instinct. My first instinct says, hey, honey, let's go that way. There's a bear over there. I don't want to be near the bear because sometimes they just get hungry and do things. But anyway, it is the case that dinosaurs and humans did exist. Why? Because God has said so, and God doesn't lie to us. When I think about existence now of the earth and this idea of Big Bang cosmology, Big Bang cosmology, and that cosmology is just a big word saying how everything started. And hopefully you got a copy of today's bulletin, because go along with this, that's why I wanted you to have that article. That article came out this week from Apologetics Press, and I thought Kyle Butt did a great job with it. Because with the swift pen, all these scientists who tell us this is exactly how it happened, this is the truth, this is scientific, we've studied it, we know it, and all of a sudden they say, you know what, we've been dead wrong about this. And what are they talking about? The size of the universe. The size of the universe. It doubled just because they said, well, you know what? We were wrong about that. It's got to be at least twice. And now they're convinced that it could be up to 250 times larger than they've been telling us all these years. So the next time you have a guy with a little bow tie on, I don't know why they always got to wear those, and trying to look real educated and has Harvard and Princeton and all those behind his name, and tells you that you're descended from a monkey, just wait, they're going to come out and change that. It's always going to change. It's constantly evolving. The only thing evolving is their doctrine, and it's constantly changing. And they've been preaching and telling us about the size of the universe now for years, and they come out that quickly and say, you know what, that's not right. Yet is there an apology? Do they say, hey, you know what, we were wrong about this, and is there any humility there? Saying, hey, we don't know everything. No, they just go right back on to telling you, hey, we know everything but that. We were wrong about that, but now we've got it. Don't buy into that. Notice, it's widely believed and has been any theory of the universe in the history of Western civilization. It's the only explanation they have other than creation, and they're just simply not going to go with that. Now this thing that they thought exploded and was only this big, in reality, it's at least 10 times larger than that, or doubled in size, and they're telling us it could be far greater. How did it happen? How did that little thing explode and go that far, and it's continuing to expand? They have no explanation, and yet they don't feel the need to. They don't feel the need to defend their doctrine. They don't feel the need to defend their discipline. But they feel a need to attack Christianity and the belief of the God of heaven in the Bible. Amazing. The science denial of the Big Bang. Now, Sir Fred Hoyle, a distinguished British astronomer, notice what he writes. He says, I don't know how long it's going to take before astronomers generally recognize that the combinational arrangement of not even one among many thousands of biopolymers on which life depends could have been arrived at by natural processes here on the earth. He says it had to be here then. There's just not a chance that everything that had to be was at the same time. He said it couldn't happen. He says, and notice, he says there's thousands of them, thousands of things that would have to be right for life to exist. He says it can't happen. And that's from 1981, and this is one of their own people. And he's upset with them. And notice he says at all events, notice he says, now imagine 10 to the 50th power blind people trying to work a Rubik's Cube. And he says the chances of all them coming together and figuring it, Simon, have you ever fooled with a Rubik's Cube? Brother, I'm sorry, I can't put one together now. I even got a little instruction booklet with it. I didn't have the patience for it. But imagine 10 to the 50th power, that's what it looks like. That many blind people trying to solve a Rubik's Cube all at the same time. And that's what this guy, who's a scientist, said, that's the probabilities of everything coming together to form life on the earth. Says it can't happen. Says it can't happen. Anthony Flew, who was the philosopher of the day back in the early 70s, when he debated Dr. Thomas B. Warren in Denton, Texas, he came out, he said, there is no God. And yet Brother Warren made him look pretty silly. And then he went back to being an agnostic, that he just wasn't sure there was a God. He had written a book that said, there is no God. A few years, he died, of course, in 2000, well, and not this, he hasn't died, but in 2004, he recanted that. He came out with a new book. I bought a copy. It says, there is no God, but the word no has been marked out, and above it is a. There is a God. You see, Dr. Flew believed everything was based upon the evolutionary process. He really bought into that. He thought that's a much better explanation for everything that we see out here than is this idea of some God somewhere just speaking all this into existence. He said, this sounds scientific to me. The thing I appreciate about him, he says, my whole life has been guided by the principles of Plato's and Socrates. Follow the evidence wherever it leads. He followed it all right. He followed it and saw that. His thing was he believed the idea of evolution, that everything started out in the ocean and then things changed and little creatures started getting up, crawling around, and then they decided they would, sprout wings and different things. And he said, you put billions of years of that. He bought into that hook, line, and sinker until this little thing came around called DNA. DNA kind of really did it for him when they took the one-celled organism and realized that it had a complex binary code, basically, that tells everything in that thing, what it ought to be doing, when it ought to be doing it. Same thing that flows in me and you. It is a code, just like a computer code, just like when you turn on your cell phone and it's doing things, it's reading code. Somebody told that phone to come up to a particular screen. It's written into its code. That's why it opens up. That's why when you slide it, it opens up, because somebody somewhere programmed it to do that. And Dr. Flew realized that's what he was looking at with DNA when they broke that open. But notice some things that he would say early on. He said that his whole life had been guided on that principle. One of the things that came up in that debate, Dr. Flew, Brother Warren showed him a picture of a man's hand and a picture of a mechanical hand. This is just something I came up with. And he said, which one of those has design? And of course, he circled the mechanical hand and said this showed design and the human hand did not. At that time, robotics certainly wasn't where they are now. They had not designed at that time a robot that could even pick up an egg without, crushing it. It just didn't have this. Nowadays, things have gotten a lot better. The technology, the size and memory of computers and so forth is so much better. But at that time, and Dr. Flew wouldn't admit that, but when the DNA came out, the idea that the single cell, the simple blob of protoplasm, that it wouldn't have been difficult. Notice, Witt noted that Darwin and his contemporaries thought that a single cell, a simple blob of protoplasm, and that it wouldn't have been difficult for nature to randomly produce so simple a thing, this little bitty, thing that went on to be something else. Well, in those days, the cell was called the black box, but it was in the 20th century, of course, that black box was open and people got a chance to look inside. And he notes, this is from the Jonathan Witt of the Discovery Institute, said there they found not a single blob, but a world of complex circuits, miniaturized motors, digital code. We know now Or we now know that even the simplest functioning cell is almost unfathomably complex, containing at least 250 genes and their corresponding proteins. Dr. Flew saw that, and he was at least honest enough to say, that didn't crawl out of no ocean. That had to be there like that. And that's what Sir Doyle a while ago was saying. It couldn't have happened by accident. All these things had to be in place at one time for life to start. And yet, you young folks, y'all are tried, people try and tell you nowadays we're a product of a monkey, and the monkey goes even on further back to small little mammals. I thought that's pretty funny because now they found a large mammal that actually has a small mammal in its belly. And the deal is the small mammal was supposed to have already been going on, and the big animal wasn't even supposed to be there yet. You see, the stories they come up with, the bone information they have, and we covered this last week, but I just want to reiterate it. When you go to the museum and you see these wonderful, huge bones and everything assembled, they're not mostly there. Usually these great representations you see are based on a couple of little bones. If you ever get a chance to read about the findings of what they call a primitive man, prehistoric man, and the different places they're named after where they're found and so forth. Lucy, you remember Lucy? Come to find out, she was manufactured from a pig's bone and a piece of a skull. They had found these things miles apart, but came together and said, this is this primitive man. Well, it was a hoax. It was a joke. And yet people are so anxious to buy into that. It's just absolutely amazing to me. Well, this was enough to convince a well-known atheist and agnostic, Dr. Flew, that, hey, you know what? There's something different out there. There's something deeper out there. The atheism, no God, no soul, and no guilt. Evolution is behind atheism. Atheism is pushed and created and encouraged by evolution. And you can see its benefits today, if you can call them that. We see people who don't care anything about human beings anymore. They're willing to take your life. They won't help you. They'll do anything they can to get ahead of you, to hurt you, as long as their needs are met. It is an I society. Why? Because we're nothing but bugs and on the food chain anyway. And if I can take what's yours and keep it, nobody says anything about it, I'm going to do it. Because it's all about me. It's no longer about being created in the image of God and having to answer as a human being. Oh, I pray that we can get on the other side of this. You want to examine the evidence. The Bible tells us prove all things. That's one of the reasons we're looking at this, because we have to prove this. The atheist, the scientist person, he has no code that says he must prove these things to Christians. But for Christians to be able to give a testimony, the witness of the Bible, and to be able to tell people what the Bible says, and when they ask, well, you say the world was created in 6 days, but these folks say it's 70 million years, and they start talking about these things, show them these things that are inconsistent with the very things that they're trying to say. But above all, prove all things, hold fast to that which is good. Do not allow current educational trends to harm your faith. Young folks, I had to sit in classes just like I'm sure you are now, except I didn't get to hear the things you're hearing right now. We just didn't have access to them. They were there, just didn't have them. And it bothered me. Hopefully you'll be able to take these tools with you and understand, and when you listen to that, realize all of it has not been proved. Young Earth proves. I was talking to Brother Nall the other day, JC, one each type. They come up to visit every now and then, and what he had said, I'd heard it before, but I had forgotten it. But it is believed that right now on the face of the earth, there are more people living than have lived since the beginning of the earth. More people alive right now. Because, man, if you've noticed, I was listening to a gospel preacher not long ago preach, and he was talking about how when he wrote the sermon, he was preaching at Faulkner. This is back in the 70s. He said, when I wrote this, there was 1.5 billion people on the earth. He said, one of these young fellows the other day told me there were 3 billion. And that had been just in his lifetime. Well, now, folks, that was just back in the 70s. And here we are in 2016, and last I heard, there's supposed to be like 7 billion people. That's how fast we're. Well, you go back a few years, just exponentially, do the numbers from how old they say we are, and go ahead and throw a few plagues in there. Go ahead and throw some wars in there, but the population would be like 50 times, what 37, it'd just be astronomical. But not only that, another young age thing, that we don't think a whole lot about this, but I remember When I was in Air Force ROTC, our colonel, he was a navigator, so he was really into maps, and he made us do flight plans and things of this nature, and I learned something that I didn't know. And do you realize that magnetic north and true north are not the same? They're off a few degrees. And do you realize that's changing all the time? And that it's getting weaker all the time? Now you start thinking about how that would have been if the earth sees millions of years old, and yet this thing is running down all the time. There is evidence of a young earth. This is changing. And I did not realize that magnetic north was growing weaker. I did not know that. But I did know that there was a difference in the two. I just assumed they were the same. But I think it was like 4 degrees or something. It's not much. But if you were flying hundreds of miles, it would mess you up. Notice Colossians 2 at verse 8. We read that this morning. Beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy, through in vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. A lot of the things that we're hearing today and being proven or being told are, as a fact, are in reality just wild hypotheses that do not have proof. Creation, origins, you cannot use the scientific method to prove origins. What is scientific method? To be able to reproduce the same thing over and over again, to test that theory. You can't do that with origins. And so for years we've been told, well, this is the scientific evidence. Well, you can't scientifically prove origins. It just doesn't fit the pattern. Notice 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 20. O Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust. Avoid profane, vain babblings and oppositions of science, falsely so called. And that's not saying all science is false, by no means whatsoever. We've made leaps and bounds medically, electronically, informational. I mean, we have, science is good as long as it stays in the realm of science. But when it tries to jump over into moral realms, when it tries to jump over into creation, when it tries to go into things that it cannot explain, such as origins, it has left the scientific method, but unfortunately they don't bother to say so. If you're here this evening, you're not a New Testament Christian. Well, salvation is in the Christ. That's the bottom line behind all this. Why are we even talking about dinosaurs? Why do we care about such things? Because behind all of it is the fact that there is a God in heaven. He created the earth. What he created for? For me and you. It's a soul-making station, if you will. How are you going to do? Are you going to be what God would have you to be? Are you going to seek him? Are you going to fear God and keep his commandments? Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 13. Or are you going to be like so many of the 7 billion, most of which will never call the God God, will never call Jesus Savior, they will never call him Lord, they will not even recognize that he was actually a person who lived on this earth. Don't be like that. You might say, well, I do believe that. Well, have you confessed that before men? Have you repented of your sins, being baptized for the remission of your sins? Has the Lord added you to the church? If not, you need to take care of that serious business. If we can help you at all, we encourage you to come as together we stand and sing.
While we pray.